Welcome back to Old School Sports and another Out of the Park baseball tutorial. This one is about contracts and other financial things. 6 tips to hopefully help you be more successful with your Out of the Park baseball series and playthroughs. I generally prefer to play as the general manager, so the off-season negotiating of contracts, making trades, drafting players, picking up international amateur free agents is a part of the game that's really interesting to me, and I probably spend more time on the off-season and planning my team than I do actually playing through in-season. But I know that there's a number of people who play OOTP who are a lot more focused on the manager aspect of the game than the general manager aspect. And I think for those of you particularly who tend to try to avoid thinking too highly and too deeply about some of the financial aspects of the game because you care more about the on-field excitement, hopefully there's definitely some tips here that will help you with that. And even those of you who play primarily as general manager and focus a little more on negotiating contracts and the financial aspects of the game will hopefully benefit from a few of these tips as well. And tip number 1 to think about when negotiating contracts and out of the park baseball is that the details matter. An example of that I'll show here with Alexis Barajas, a very accomplished pitcher, won a Cy Young Award for us over a decade ago at this point. We made a big triade with Miami when he was 25 years old to bring him on board, and he has been an incredible pitcher for us over the years. 207 and 95 record with a 3.29 ERA over his career in Buffalo. And you can see he's been a perennial all-star, and he's also been a member of all 6 of the World Championship teams that we have put together here in our Buffalo Wings playthrough. But the last time Mr. Barajas became a free agent was 3 years ago, and I believe he was looking for a 5 or a 6-year contract with a player option towards the end of it. We ended up signing him to a 4-year contract with a team option for the 4th season. And you can see the first 3 years of this contract have worked out well for us. 12-9 with a 3.48 ERA, 16-9 with a 3.81 ERA, and then 14-7 this past year with a 3.98 ERA. He's led the league in the fewest walks per 9 inning each of the past 2 years. But unfortunately, when we look at the now 39-year-old Mr. Barajas scouting report, he has really started to regress over this past year. His stuff has dropped 10 points since spring training. The movement on his pitches is lower, and he's lost about 5 miles an hour in velocity. So we, fortunately, as I mentioned, have the 4th year of his contract as a team option. He, as I mentioned, wanted a player option towards the end of this contract and more years than we ended up offering him. If we had just given him what he wanted initially, 5 or 6 years with a team with a player option at the end, we could be looking at another 3 million years of obligation, or 3 years at $20+ million a year of obligations with Mr. Barajas. Instead, we're going to pay him a $2,500 buyout to get out of that 4th year. I did just shop him. Another thing, if you've got a player on a team option that you're not going to pick up, you can always try to shop him and see if you can get something in return. Maybe you get an asset back in return. And at the very least, even if that asset's not valuable, you're at least being the one who avoids paying the buyout if that's what you were going to do anyways. In this case, there's no market at all for him. I think other teams see what we see. His stuff has regressed, and when we look at his pitching splits from this past season, you can see that in August he pitched to a 5.68 ERA. In September, his ERA was 6.66. So he seems like a player who has just gotten old very quickly and very suddenly and very dramatically. And if we hadn't cared about the details on this contract, we could be paying him for another 2 or 3 years. Fortunately, the timing of this one worked out just about perfectly for us. And it's unlikely that we will be bringing back Barajas next year, but another benefit of, especially when you have older players with team options, is that if it is somebody you want to bring back, you can oftentimes save some money by declining that option. I think that will certainly be the case here with Mr. Barajas. So we are going to go ahead and agree to pay him the buyout of $2.5 million to void his last contract year. So he is now officially set to become a free agent. But if we decided that we wanted to offer him a contract and bring him back, you can see he's only looking for 4 years at $10 million a year now. So even though we spent the $2.5 million on him to void that last year of the contract, if he was somebody that we wanted to bring back next year, we would still be well ahead of the game than paying him $22 million for next season. We're not going to negotiate an extension with Barajas. I think as good as our pitching staff has been, and we've had the best pitching staff in baseball the last few years in Buffalo, at his age, with his ability, he's going to struggle just to make our team. He actually was not on our playoff roster for the recently completed postseason. But when you get into the point where you're negotiating contracts with a player like this, you definitely want to think about all of the little nitty-gritty details. You can see what he's demanding. And again, if you're more of a manager type player, there can definitely be an inclination to just meet the demand and then submit the offer. But I'll do this live. I feel a little bad because Barajas has been such a big-time player in our organization. But for purposes of this tutorial, it's not going to bother me to make him a little bit angry before he moves on. I'm more interested in making you, as the viewer, knowledgeable and happy, and I am about making a mythical player, Alexis Barajas, in 2047 happy. So we're going to think about this contract. No way that we're going to give him $10 million a year for 4 years. No way we're going to have a player option for the final season. We're actually going to see what he thinks about $8 million for the first year and cut this down to a 3-year contract, make it a team option for the final season. And we will give him a little bit of respect. The average number is going to be $9 million over 3 years, but they're still well below the $10.125 million over 4 years that he was looking for. We're not going to guarantee him a spot in the starting rotation, and I don't mind leaving in these bonuses because there's no way with his skill set at this point that he's going to be winning a Cy Young Award or getting an All-Star selection. So this is a way to kind of make him feel a little better about things by increasing the bonuses for those. He's got an ego as a borderline Hall of Fame major league pitcher. If it's a player who you think can win those, you want to try to keep those as little as possible. But in the case of a player like Barajas, where the likelihood of exercising either of those bonuses is almost zero, I think they're fine to keep in there. Normally, want to limit player opt-outs. Normally, you want to not include no trade clauses. Normally, if you can, you want to not promise a role. You want to keep as much leverage as possible. In the case of Barajas, he's a 10-5 guy with us, so he's got a no trade clause by virtue of his service time and his contract situation regardless. But we'll see what he thinks of this offer. Oh, sorry, I messed up. Of course, I have to include a buyout for that final season. And he's willing to think about it. Now, we're not actually going to submit this offer to him. But like I said, even if you're focused more on playing manager, don't just hit the meat demand initially. I probably could have gotten this contract even lower than it is, but we gave him less money, fewer years. We didn't promise him a role. We turned a player option in year 4 into a team option in year 3. And of course, we didn't give him any opt-outs, the no trade clause he has, but we didn't include one explicitly. So paying attention to all of these little details matters and can ultimately, over time, save your team millions of dollars, and you can invest that millions of dollars into additional better players. You can invest it into your farm system and player development and scouting, or if you're playing with the owner goals on and you've got financial goals from an owner that are applicable over the next few seasons, the money that you save can help you achieve those goals as well. So think about all the details when you're signing players to contracts, and don't cut corners. And the second point to think about when renewing and negotiating contracts with people is that every dollar matters. And this tags on to what we were just talking about with the first point about the details. But while the financial engine in OOTP is perhaps not as rich as in games like Football Manager, it is still pretty extensive. And the more money that you have available by signing players to intelligent contracts, as I just touched upon, gives you more money to use in scouting, player development, the draft budget, more money that you can ultimately use in the international amateur free agent budget, because although most teams have the 4.75 million budget cap, you still need to set aside money to actually be able to spend there. I talked about the owner goals. I don't have the owner goals on in this playthrough, but the better you do in terms of saving every dollar, that's going to help you with financially oriented owner goals. And then ultimately, you do get evaluated based on the P&L for your past year. You can see we just made over $28 million this past season in 2047 in Buffalo, and that resulted in a $6 million bump to $258 million for next year's budget, which is the highest that we have ever had in this playthrough. So take the time to think through the budgets, think about every dollar that you're spending, and when you get to this time of year, when you are going through salary arbitration and you're taking a look at which contracts you have on the books for next year and how expensive they are, before you get to free agency, review even all of the guys who are on your 40-man roster with major league minimum contracts. And you can see we've got a ton of those players on this team right now. But there are some of them that probably are not part of your long-term plans. And even just cutting or trading away a guy who's making $720 million guaranteed next year, you do that with 2 or 3 or 4 players, and all of a sudden you could have $2 or $3 million extra. When you get to February and March and the free agent market starts drying up, that $2 or $3 million that you saved by getting rid of the 37th, 38th, 39th, and 40th person on your 40-man roster may let you pick up a pretty useful player who's actually going to be on your 26-man roster next year and contribute to you trying to win games next year. So whether it's negotiating contracts or just kind of looking at the obligations you have out into the future, keep an eye on every penny. It should go without saying, but it can be the difference between having money to spend on a free agent, having money to take on a contract closer to the trade deadline, or having extra money to put into scouting and player development, and not having money for those things if you let the little things slide. Contract tip number 3 in Out of the Park Baseball is to think about locking up your young stars early. This is something that we've seen more and more in real baseball in recent years. The Kansas City Royals in the last month or two did it with Bobby Witt Jr. The Atlanta Braves have probably been the leaders in all of Major League Baseball over the past several years in terms of doing this. But particularly if you are a mid or smaller market team, this is a way to generate some alpha, to kind of mix metaphors with a financial term here, that can pay off for you for years to come. We have two young players, Jim Riker and Arturo Casares, that are cornerstones of our team that we've done this with recently. Riker, we signed to an 11-year deal up to $119 million. He is, at this point, barely has 3 years of major league service, and we've been paying him more than the major league minimum the last couple years. This coming year, we may be paying him a bit more than we would have in his first potential arbitration season. But then you start going out to his later arbitration years and his free agent years, and the fact that we were willing to give him financial certainty allowed us to get him at a price that is definitely discounted to the performance that he has put up on the field. He's led the National League in ribbies 2 straight years now, was the National League most valuable player a year ago, has a profile that suggests he should be a great slugger for years to come, even though he's not a particularly useful defensive player. The risk when you sign players like this is that they get injured or they don't meet the full potential. But if you're not playing as a huge market team like the Dodgers or the Yankees or the Mets or the Red Sox before John Henry decided he was on a budget, this is a definite way to roll the dice a little bit. And in most cases, if you've scouted the players well and you know their ability, it's going to work out well for you. There are going to be those players who surprisingly regress or don't meet their full potential or just have a bunch of injuries that you end up losing out on. But I think that locking up the young stars early, like we've seen in the MLB, is an important way to keep your contracts at a reasonable amount. Arturo Casares, another guy that I mentioned, $2 million or 2 years in the majors, and we paid him $4.2 million this past season. So we're paying him way more than he would have made, because he would have been the major league minimum last year, the major league minimum this year, and then the major league minimum of $720,000 next year in his third season. Even the $8.5 million when he's 26 is probably more than he would have made his first year in arbitration. But after that, we start getting into some pretty attractive years in terms of he's going to be making less from us than he would have in those last couple arbitration years if he keeps performing the way that we think he will. And then we also bought out several free agent years. And you can see my point about keeping your options open and thinking about the details. Even though we expect Arturo Casares, with the brilliant start to his batting career at this point, 30-plus homers each of his first 2 seasons, 131 and 129 WRC pluses. If injuries sink him, or if the contract goes bad for some other reason, we do have team options for the final 2 years, and those are also the biggest dollar years in this contract that help made the total value be something that he was interested in signing. So thinking about trying to lock up the young stars early is an important strategy. But even when you're doing that, and even when you think a guy is going to be a cornerstone of your team for years to come, if you can get better terms and conditions for yourself, you should definitely think about doing this. And it doesn't always have to be with the superstars, though. Another guy that we've done this with is Luis Palencia. He's a guy who we traded for in 2040 from the Mets. He's a good, solid, right-handed relief pitcher. The fans love him. He can also start for us in a pinch, although his stamina isn't incredible. Over the course of his career, he's been a nice pitcher for us, 3.49 ERA over 204 innings. And it seems that players who can start, they've got the 3 or 4 pitchers that you'd like to see in a starter, but don't necessarily have high stamina, can be pretty good value in the game. And we ended up signing him to a 10-year, $17.5 million deal that he's halfway through at this point. So we're kind of spending some bigger numbers on him. But for a guy who could start for us in the pinch and who is still a pretty valuable arm in our bullpen, I think I'm happy to have him signed for the next 5 years. a good, reliable right-handed reliever, and you can see he's been a part of our last 4 World Championship teams here in Buffalo, so he's certainly been a contributor for us, even though he hasn't actually ever started a game for us because our rotation has been so deep. But we know that with his 4-pitch arsenal and his 40 stamina, he could start for us if we needed him to. Contract tip number 4 is to avoid going to arbitration with your players at all costs. You can save a few minutes, you see what the arbitration estimates are, and you can just include those arbitration estimates to the players and go to arbitration. But there's 2 reasons why you don't want to do that. First and foremost is you can generally get players to sign for 95% plus $1 of what their arbitration estimate is. This is a well-known fact in the game. I'm not breaking any ground here. I think it would actually be kind of cool if OOTP put a little more variability around that. But looking at Jim Coles, who's been our number 5 starter for the last 3 years, 27-year-old, he's now moving into his arbitration years. Made the major league minimum this year, and he's set to make $2.6 million next season, or at least that's the expectation for him in arbitration. So we could just keep our team offer at the $2.6 million, have him go to arbitration in a few weeks. We'll have submitted $2.6 million. He'll likely come in and say, hey, I want $3.3 million, something like that. The arbitrator will decide, and will be either on the books for the $2.6 million for Coles that we projected, or the $3.3 million that he submitted to the arbitration. But we can also negotiate with him ahead of time, and I mentioned that 95% number. When we offer him a contract extension, he says here he wants $2.88 million, so that may be the number that he was interested in putting into the arbitrator. But using my handy-dandy calculator, I know that 95% of $2.6 million, which is his expected arbitration number, is $2.47. In the case of Coles, he is going to be in our starting rotation next year. Normally, I would not promise the role, but he also has a captain personality that applies when he's a starter for us. So that's why I expect him to be in the starting rotation next year. So I don't mind including a promised role for him if, when I think about my team for the next season, I know that he's going to be in that role. And it's also easier to do here in arbitration, where it's just a 1-year commitment, as opposed to telling someone who you're going to be signing for 10 years that, yes, you're going to be our cleanup hitter, or yes, you're going to be in our starting rotation, or yes, you're going to be our closer, and then have them, when that changes 2 or 3 years into a contract, angry at you. But if I offer him the exact 95%, you can see he thinks we're getting close, but he's not happy enough with the offer to go on. So what we really need to do is offer him a bit more than that $2.47 million. We could get away with $2,471,000. But what I have seen is sometimes if you play it really close with the amount, the player says, I'll think about that contract, and then he comes back a week later and says, no, it's not quite enough. I still want to negotiate. So we're going to offer him $2.5 million for next year, which should be more than enough to get him to agree. So we're going to ask for the response. He says that's a fair offer since it's over that 95% threshold. We will submit the offer to Coles. And what this is ultimately going to do for us is we're going to get him signed for $2.5 million, as opposed to the 2.6 that we were going to submit to arbitration, or the 2.8, 2.9, 3 million, whatever arbitration number that he was going to sign for. And second, and this is the underrated and underappreciated part of this, that if you don't think about the financials much, you might not appreciate. But when you re-sign these arbitration-eligible players, some of them are popular with the fans, and some of them are going to get the fans excited when you sign them to that 1-year extension. And when that happens, you're going to get a little boost to your fan interest. Now, here with Buffalo, we've had a lot of success, so we're already over 100, which is the biggest number that they include. But when you sign the arbitration eligible players proactively, you will from time to time see the fans are excited that you re-sign player X or player Y, and you get a small boost in fan interest, or the fans are ecstatic about this and you get a massive boost in fan interest. If you let those players go to arbitration, even though they're going to re-sign with your team, either at the number that you submitted or the number that they submitted to the arbitration, you're not going to get that little boost to fan interest. So focusing on what's going on in arbitration and avoiding arbitration, you can save some money if you do it wisely, and you can also get a boost to fan interest. So if at all possible, don't let any of the players that you're interested in actually go to arbitration. And before we move on to our fifth and final tip on contracts, I just kind of want to come back to the team salary page and see here that although I want to have as many team options as possible, and I want to avoid player options, and I'm certainly not going to include them in contracts from the start, there are situations where you're going to need to include a no-trade clause, or you're going to need to include more money, or you're going to need to include a player option or an opt-out to get deals done. And it's fine to do that. You need to pay attention to the details, but you also need to get the players that you want to get signed. So you can see here with our ace, Jim Lance, when I signed him to a long extension, I do have team options for the final 2 years of his contract, but he is a player opt-out after the 2051 season. Ramiro Medina, our second baseman, who I just recently signed to an extension, had to give him a player option for the final year to get things done. Jim Reichert, who we already talked about, had to give him a player option as well. But you can see the preponderance of these contracts are more guys with team options, whether it's Danny Ferguson in the final year of Arturo Casares, the last 2 years of Floyd Auclair, the last 2 years of Chris McClintock, the last 2 years of Ishmael Velasco, the last year of Nehemiah Vidale. You want to keep as many options open as possible, and the details matter, as I touched upon earlier. But you got to be flexible, and you got to ultimately decide what's worth giving in on to get a contract done, and are you really willing to walk away because a player wants a player option in the final season. And you can see that there's circumstances where, although I've tried to avoid it, I've decided ultimately relenting on this point, and some others still made sense from my perspective. And our last and final tip on contracts is to take advantage of the baseball collective bargaining agreement. Most teams, even if you're the Yankees, even if you're the Dodgers, most teams are always going to be kind of cash strapped. There's always another free agent you'd like to sign. There's always another high-priced player that you'd like to trade for to improve your team in a perfect world. There's always more money that you can spend on scouting and player development, or to put aside to sign players that you draft or players that you pick up in international free agency. And this is part of the reason why I made the point earlier that every dollar matters. But as great it is to re-sign players or to sign players like we talked about, Reichert, Casares, Palencia, to contracts when they're early, one of the big benefits to the baseball collective bargaining agreement to mid and smaller market teams is the price certainty that you have over the first 6 or 7 years of a player's career. We can see here we've got a nice young left fielder, Daniel Aguayo-Leal. He only hit .210 for us this year, but did have 15 homers and 42 ribbies in just 286 at-bats. Not much defensively, not much speed, but still has a bat and the ability to hit a strong number of home runs, consistently draw walks, and he's also a switch hitter. So he is a useful player. Now, is he at the same level as Casares, who we talked about in the outfield? No, he's certainly not. But the nice thing about the baseball collective bargaining agreement is that when we look at Daniel Aguayo-Leal, we just paid him the major league minimum this past year. We're going to be paying him the major league minimum a year after that. And then you can see when he gets into his arbitration years, he's expected to make $2.2, $3.6, $5.5, and $7 million a year. By not signing a guy like Aguayo-Leal to a long-term contract, we can really benefit from that optionality. He's going to be very cost-effective making the major league minimum next year, and if he's still a productive player for the next few seasons, around $2 million, around $3.5 million seem like they are more than reasonable amounts for him, and contracts that he is almost certainly going to outperform in terms of the dollar value that he delivers on the field. So we kind of look at Aguayo-Leal and think the next 3 years we're going to be getting pretty good value from him with the dollars that we think we're going to be paying him. And then by the time he's 30, when he's in line at this point, we think to make $5.5 million a year, maybe $7 million a year after that. He might not be as good value for us. We might have youngsters who are now making the major league minimum that we can use to replace him. So we've taken the benefit from those cheap early seasons out of a guy like Aguayo-Leal. Another situation that I'm thinking about this right now is with all of our young shortstops. You can see we've got Josh Fuchs making the minimum next year and then not huge amounts after that. Juan Palomo, similar situation, making the minimum next year. He's been more productive on the field, so his numbers are going up higher. And then we've got a third young shortstop in Jim Weisenbach, expected to be making the minimum for 2 more years, and then his arbitration numbers are going to grow. I'm not 100% sure which one of these 3 young shortstops is our future. I'm not honestly 100% sure that any of these 3 young shortstops are our future. But these next few years, while they are under team control at either the major league minimum or potentially bargain basement prices compared to what they'd get on the open market, we can take advantage of that arbitrage and have them on our team, hopefully delivering a lot more dollars than they're really worth and what we're paying for them. And then if over time we decide, Palomo's not the answer, we want to move on from him, as soon as he starts getting too expensive for what his arbitration costs are, we either waive and DFA him, or more effectively, if trying to make every penny count, we try to trade Palomo for somebody who we think has some value, get him off our books and at least get something in return. And then maybe if we think that Fuchs and Weisenbach are the answers going forward, we do sign one of them to a longer term extension. We have to wait 2 or 3 years to do that, so we may not get the same type of bargain that I think we got with the likes of Reichert and Casares. But with guys that we're not as sure about and guys who are still making the absolute minimum, sometimes the best thing to do is to just take advantage of the rules in baseball that give you those 6 or 7 years of control for the players through the early to mid-20s, oftentimes through the prime of their career at bargain basement levels, and then let them run through that contract and hit free agency, because when they hit free agency after that 6th or 7th year, they're going to be making a ton more money if they're a big-time player. But you can also give that player a qualifying offer at that point, and if they refuse that qualifying offer and go on and sign with another team, you're going to get some draft pick compensation in return that you can reinvest into your organization. So in a perfect world, you'd lock up everybody with a perfect contract as early as possible, but the world is not perfect. And even though we've got a very successful save going here in Buffalo, you can see right now, even after we decline that option on Barajas at the start of the episode, we've got less than $7 million to spend on contracts for the upcoming 2048 season, and we don't really have any money available for extensions in 2049. You can see our salary obligations that year are going to grow over $40 million from where we expect to be next season. Now, the positive thing, as I've talked about, we've got a lot of team options that year. So that's going to give us a bit of a cushion in terms of getting the salary back under control. But for the time being, since we don't have a ton of money to play with, we're probably not going to be trying to sign all of these guys, the three shortstops, Aguayo, Leal, Coles, who we talked about earlier. We're not going to be signing all of those guys to extensions because we just don't have the financial wherewithal to make it happen. So taking advantage of the rules of the CBA and having those players on your team when they are relatively cheap and inexpensive and cost effective, and hopefully in most cases delivering value to you far in excess of what you're paying them. Sometimes the best decision when thinking about contracts is to just take advantage of that. And with that, we've shared our 5 tips on how to be more successful with your contract negotiations in OOTP. Before we review the 5 tips, though, one other thing to consider. Meant to mention this when I was talking about avoiding arbitration hearings, but there is one other thing to think about here. Juan Ramirez is a catcher who had been our starter for several years. We actually moved him into a backup role this year. He hit just a .193 with 3 homers and 187 ribbies, and he is set to be making over $8 million next year. Now, this may not be the most popular decision with the fans because, as it turned out, Ramirez was our catcher against left-handed pitchers, and we faced 4 lefties in the World Series, and he just won the World Series MVP award. But I don't think it makes sense for us to pay $8 million plus to a backup catcher next year. So I will most likely be moving on from Juan Ramirez. But when he's an arbitration eligible player, I could just change my offer here to 0 and say, we're not going to give you an arbitration offer, we're going to let you leave, and that would be fine. But the thing that you're going to want to do with any players that you're ultimately going to make a 0 offer to is to at least shop those players. If you're going to move on from them anyways, see if there's any market at all out there for them. And in the case of Ramirez, you can see there's players that we can get in return. Whether any of these guys are superstars, probably not. But it looks like there's definitely a fair amount of corner outfielders, middle relievers with some potential. This guy here, Jeremy Fraga, is a familiar name. He's a knuckleballer who we've been kind of monitoring his career since he was originally available in the draft. I believe we were picking like 32nd or 33rd that year, and then we had another supplemental pick a few picks later. We passed on him with our first pick, and then he was gone a pick or 2 after we went. But knuckleballers can be pretty interesting, and he's a guy who's still making the major league minimum. I don't know if he's actually the guy that we will trade away. You can see another guy, and again, I'm just going with the stars here, doing it quickly while I'm talking to you to keep things simple. Mike Leamer, a first baseman, certainly a decent right-handed bat who's got some value. He is set to make more money next year, $4.7 million, so he's a little less attractive. But you can see there's plenty of options out here for a starting quality catcher like Juan Ramirez. So if the decision is ultimately that you're not going to keep an arbitration eligible player, you might as well shop him on the market and see if you can get something in return, because it looks like if we ultimately do decide that we don't want to bring Ramirez back at $8 million next year, we can probably get something pretty interesting in return rather than just giving a $0 offer to him and letting him become a free agent. And with that bonus tip out of the way, we'll talk about our 5 tips to improve your contract negotiations in OOTP. Number 1, the details matter. Number 2, every dollar matters. Number 3, try to lock up your young stars early. Number 4, do everything possible to avoid arbitration hearings with your players. And number 5, take advantage of the CBA. And I think if you try to integrate some of these ideas into the way that you negotiate contracts in OOTP, you're likely to end up saving some money. You're likely to end up getting your team into some difficult situations in future years. And you're ultimately, and most importantly, more likely to be successful on the field by saving as much money as possible. And hopefully these tips will allow you to do that. If you've got some other tips on contracts that we didn't talk about in this episode, would love to hear them in the comments section down below. And until our next tutorial, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.